I so desperately want to belong. I have been living in my home country since I was born, but officially I do not exist. I am a so-called stateless person.
I am over 60 years old now. Most of my life I've fled from war, hunger and prosecution together with my family.
My government decided that I am part of a minority whose citizenship is to be taken away. I have been stateless ever since, just because they said so. I went to school for 7 years. When I was getting ready to graduate, they asked me for my papers. I don't have any papers. They told me that without papers I cannot graduate. All my schooling is worthless without a formal certificate.
After searching for a long time, we finally found a country that allowed us to stay, but everything is different. I lost my papers while fleeing, and my country refuses to issue me new ones. Under no circumstances will I be granted another citizenship in the new country. I have to take care of my family, but without papers, no one will give me a job here.
I always wanted to start a family, and now I'm finally pregnant. But as happy as I am about having a child, I'm also increasingly afraid. I will not be able to have the baby in a hospital because I have no insurance. I don't have enough money to pay for hospital treatment. Without proper papers, I would have to pay the same amount as foreigners do. My child won't even get a birth certificate. I wonder why my child should have to suffer just because I don't have formal identification.
Although my daughter-in-law was born here, this is one of 27 countries in the world where women are not allowed to pass on their nationality to their children. Only the man can do that. But my son would need his own papers for that, and we don't have them either. Without documents, he and his children will remain stateless. It's going to be almost impossible for them to study or to find a proper job.
Stateless people exist everywhere in the world. The exact number is unknown because very little data on stateless people is collected. But given the high estimated number of unreported cases, experts assume that there are at least 10 million stateless people in the world. For the most part, state regulations excluding certain people, along with flight and migration, are the principal causes leading to people losing their citizenship or never receiving it in the first place. Their fates differ from one another, but the consequences remain the same, as they are denied their most basic rights: education, medical treatment, security, the right to ownership, opportunities to work and to pass on their nationality to their children, to vote or to simply travel. Everyone is entitled to these universal rights. They cannot be tied to any kind of citizenship.
I dream of a world where my family feels safe and would like to see it come to pass before I die.
How on earth can it be that I am here in flesh and blood and yet do not exist?
So there you have it. It's an incredible story, and as I said, hard to believe that this carries on with so many millions of people affected by statelessness. And at the beginning I should have said, my name is Peter Ndora, and it's great to be broadcasting from South Africa, because I know that many of you are connected in many parts of the world, and we are grateful for the technology that brings the globe together in this way. So welcome to you wherever you may be across the world, and thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. A conversation that I'm very happy to say is being led and championed by a good number of people, and one of them is the Program Director for Social Rights at Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, and that's Eva Wuchhold. And I'd just like to call upon her now just to say a few words of welcome and set the scene for us. Eva?
Many thanks, Peter, and a warm welcome on behalf of the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung. My name is Eva Wuchhold, and I'm the Program Director Social Rights at the Geneva office. I'm delighted to be able to celebrate today the launch of the Atlas of the Stateless, as well as the reader to the Atlas, together with the authors. They represent not only many of the countries included in the Atlas, but also many institutions that are important in the fight against statelessness. Thanks to their contributions, the Atlas has become an impressive product that we will use in our work on statelessness from now on, as hopefully will many others. Derived from our namesake, Rosa-Luxemburg, the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung envisions a democratic socialist society in which the free development of each individual, regardless of origin, gender, nationality, or religion, is the basis for the free development of all. This is why the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung supports the fight for social rights of groups affected by exploitation, discrimination, or racism, including stateless persons. Social rights are individual, basic and human rights to which every individual is entitled on the basis of her or his humanity alone. Since the Foundation wants to give marginalized groups a voice, the work on statelessness is essential. But now I'm looking forward to the contributions of the authors and all further contributions in the context of today's launch. Thank you, Peter, for guiding us through the event.
Eva, thanks very much indeed for those words of welcome and also setting the stage, I think, for an important discussion that we'll be having for the rest of this broadcast. And I've got to say that we are grateful for the work that you and your team are championing, particularly with projects such as the Atlas project. So thank you very much indeed. That was Eva Buchfold. All right, so as I said, we've got a number of authors that have contributed to this publication, and they're going to share some of the insights in their articles that appear in this publication. And we begin with Joanna Katarina Seidel, who is currently working on statelessness in Rwanda and previously worked in Uganda with the Maragoli and the Bene and other communities who are excluded from accessing citizenship in Uganda. Now, prior to that, Johanna has been working in the broader human rights field, focusing on forced displacement in the Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes. We're so happy to have with her here, representing herself in her personal capacity, but she is going to be talking to us about the case of the Maragoli and the Bene communities that are forced to neglect their cultural identity in order to navigate legal belonging, despite being legally entitled to Ugandan citizenship. So a very warm welcome to Johanna Katarina Seidel. Johanna, if I could just ask you before you start to press a little button on the bottom left hand that says Start Video. All right, Johanna, maybe you can start.
Yes. Let me start. I'll see how I can figure out the video in the meantime.
All right, great.
Yes. Thanks very much for having me. So maybe to give a little bit of background on my article, as you just mentioned, it discusses the case of the Maragoli and the Bennett communities, and how the nationality framework in Uganda sort of compelled them to give up their cultural identity for legal belonging and to access citizenship, despite having an entitlement to it. And so maybe to give a little bit of background generally on Uganda. So citizenship in Uganda at birth is granted to those whose parents or grandparents are members of the indigenous communities of Uganda that are listed in Annex to the 1995 Constitution. And that list currently sort of constitutes 65 communities. And it should be all those that resided in Uganda as of February 1926. However, as you already said, there are a number of communities that have been left out of this list and so have challenges in accessing their citizenship. All of them are minorities. Those include the Maragoli, the Benet, and other communities. And they have been in Uganda since prior to this cutoff date of 1926. But still haven't been included in that list of indigenous communities. And so for these communities, it became particularly challenging since 2015, when national IDs were introduced in Uganda ahead of the general election. And this was a very big turning point for the community, as now you needed an ID to access services, banking, health services, all kinds of essential services. And because they were not included in that list in the Constitution, or have been left out of that list, they couldn't get IDs, and in turn they couldn't get services. And so what then happened as a result was that these communities sort of saw themselves compelled to register under the face of different ethnic groups, mainly that they share linguistic and cultural ties with, and that live sort of in the same area, but to make sure that they can access citizenship in Uganda.
All right. Okay, we'd love to see you. So I don't know if you can see on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there is a camera, and you just have to press there where it says start video. I hope you can figure that out, because we'd love to see you. You've written great work, and we'd love to put a face. There you go. Yep. Fantastic. Love to put a face to the work that you're doing. All right. Okay. So seen and experienced. And I just wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on the core thesis of your article in just a few sentences, perhaps.
Yes, hold on. Sorry, I can unfortunately hear you not very well. I have to put the phone far away from myself. Could you just repeat the question? I'm really sorry.
I was just saying that if you could perhaps, in a couple of sentences, take us through the core thesis of your article.
Yes. So, as I just said, I think the core of it is the fact that these communities in Uganda, and all of them minorities, that have been left out of the constitutional list of indigenous communities, cannot access citizenship at the moment unless they register under other ethnic groups or tribes that are included on that list, and sort of that forces them to give up their cultural identity for their citizenship and for their legal belonging.
What does that do to a person when they know that and feel a certain ethnicity, but they're almost forced to abandon it?
Well, it's definitely a plight for these communities. It's also living in fear, because essentially you registered under a different ethnicity. So your identity documents are incorrect, and this can also have consequences, legal consequences, for those whose IDs might be challenged.
All right, so now the Atlas of the Statelessness is only the beginning, I guess, of the work on statelessness. What else do you think we should be able to, focus on in the future in the issues, particularly in the context of Uganda?
So at the moment, there is a big move. There has been some developments that the Maragoli will be included into this list of indigenous communities in the constitution soon. It is currently in a second reading at Parliament, and so one of the things that that needs more work is to ensure that also other communities like the Benet, there's also others, the Bachingwe and the Bagabo, that those are also included in the list of indigenous communities. And then also Uganda is currently in the process of acceding the 1961 Stateless Convention, and so that is also a good time to strengthen the advocacy efforts, civil society and others, and with the communities, to ensure that not only these are included, but that also other obligations of Uganda with regard to statelessness are upheld, such as, for example, the childhood statelessness safeguard that, for example, is included in the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which Uganda is a party to, and which is also provided under Article 1 of the 1961 Convention. So these would be sort of two points that could be taken up in future.
All right, Johanna, I want to thank you very much indeed for your contribution and also the work that you continue to do. Thanks so much indeed for being part of this very important broadcast. Thank you so much. All right, that's Johanna Katarina Seidel. And just to let you know, because a lot of you are watching this via Zoom, there is a chat function, so we invite you, if you've got a question that you'd like to put through to any of the authors, or perhaps share an idea inspired by something that you might hear during this broadcast, type in and make it as short as possible. You don't want to write a thesis. Make a few questions, a few ideas, and we'll pick them up, and then perhaps we're able to share those with our speakers, and they might be able to answer some of your questions as well. All right.
Many Roma people have no papers and no rights. Roma people still experience difficulties in applying for a residence permit or citizenship. Majority of European societies have always tended to reject them. After the war in Yugoslavia was over, Germany and other European countries concluded readmission agreements with the Balkan states to deport Roma people to the Balkan countries. Deported Roma often have refugee status. Many have no valid identity documents. They can only find accommodation in poor, informal settlements, and they cannot register as residents. Unfortunately, various programs for Roma integration and inclusion have not led to a significant improvement in situation of the Roma in Europe. On the contrary, the rise of the right-wing extremism in Europe and the Balkans means that Roma through Europe are now living in fear again.
Up to now, and despite the UNHCR lobbying, Madagascar has not acceded to the UN Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness of 1961 and the UN Convention relating to the status of stateless persons of 1965. Nevertheless, there is increasing awareness of the authorities for the issue of statelessness. On 1st July of this year, the plenum of the Senate passed a bill to modify provisions of the Nationality Code in order to give concrete solutions to resolve statelessness by 2024 and to permit Malagasy women to confer their nationality to their non-national spouses, as Malagasy men can do. it will be referred to the National Assembly for consideration and possibly adoption.
Well, thanks very much indeed to some of the authors that you're going to be hearing throughout the course of this program, sharing their thoughts, as I said, about some of the insights they gained and put in terms of words and contributing to this atlas, a publication that we are launching today officially online because of the technology and the world that we're living in at the moment. This is how we're able to do it. All right, so we've heard from one author. Another article that's been contributed to this atlas is by Thomas McGee, who's a PhD researcher at the Peter McCullen Centre on Statelessness at the Melbourne Law School or University of Melbourne. And his latest publications are Born of ISIS, Genocide, Risk of Statelessness and Stigmatized Nationality Acquisition for Children of Yazidi Survivors, as well as Rainbow Statelessness Between Sexual Citizenship and Legal Theory, exploring the statelessness of LGBTIQ plus nexus. He contributed to the atlas by providing an article, How the Nature of Statelessness in Syria Has Changed Since the Start of the Conflict in the country in 2011. A big welcome to Thomas McGee. Thanks for joining us, Thomas.
Thank you very much.
All right, share your thoughts with us.
Sure. So essentially, my article looks at how conflict in a country can change the experiences of those who are stateless, and equally how it can produce new situations and risks of statelessness. So to begin with, Syria is a country that has had several key groups who've experienced protracted, that is long-term statelessness. This includes Palestinian refugees who've been stateless since 1948, and also the Kurds in the country who were deprived of their citizenship. Some of the Kurds in the country deprived of their citizenship in 1962. So within the article, I was looking at how such individuals have had new experiences within the conflict, and at the same time looking at some of the new risks of statelessness, for example, for Syrian children born outside or inside the country. And one of the key points I'm stressing in the article is just the variety of these changes, and that often we really can't understand the full picture based on statistics and figures alone. So just one quick example there is in 2011, the government, the political situation meant that the government decided to naturalize one section of the stateless Kurds, which has resulted in an overall drop in the figure of stateless people inside Syria. But I think it's really important that we ask ourselves questions such as, how do those who went through the naturalization process actually feel about it? What about those who are excluded? Does it feel like a fair process? And what's the discourse that's surrounded it? So that was really what I was trying to address in the piece that I authored.
All right. I mean, it sounds like displacement and statelessness often can become interrelated.
Sure. Yeah, so there's a very complex relation between displacement and statelessness, and it's something I'll try and unpack. So firstly, it's really important to make clear that statelessness and displacement are quite separate issues, although in certain cases they do intersect. What I mean by saying they're separate issues is that we need to understand that not every person who's displaced and not every person who's a refugee is stateless. And in fact, the vast majority of refugees in the world are not stateless. Equally, most stateless people are living in their own country, and their statelessness might have nothing to do with displacement. But as is presented in the atlas, equally there are many stateless people who have experienced discrimination and cannot access key services in their home country. So this becomes a push factor to leave that country. At the same time, I've also mentioned already how there can be increased risks of statelessness for children who are born in displacement contexts. So we know that it's logical that navigating birth registration procedures can be incredibly complicated, especially when the laws, policies, and maybe even the language are unknown. So yes, statelessness can be a cause of displacement. It can also be a consequence of displacement, but not always. We need to remember that.
All right. I mean, you mentioned Palestinians, for example, and I just wonder, when you have generations, children born outside of their country, and all they know is this statelessness, this must have quite a deep psychological effect on identity. Yeah,
I mean, it certainly does. And I think it's also really important that we try and understand what those who are affected by the issue have to say, because there are many Palestinians who equally feel a little bit uncomfortable with the term stateless or statelessness. It's legally, it might apply to them, but they might prefer that term is simply not used for them, despite the fact that there have been significant impacts, as you say, psychologically, as well as material consequences.
All right. Well, what do you think can be done? What other things should we be focusing on, particularly in the context of Syria that you've looked at in your article?
Sure. I mean, in general, I think, as I was saying, we really need to take our lead from those who are affected by statelessness themselves. So I think it's really important that we check that our language and framing when we're raising this issue is appropriate and sensitive in the eyes of those who are themselves stateless. Based on when I've been speaking to Syrian families, one issue that I consistently hear is concerns around birth registration, particularly in refugee contexts. So there's certainly a lot more that can be done there in terms of advocacy and awareness work. I guess equally in Europe, many young stateless Syrians often mention challenges that they face around lack of certification for study that they've undertaken. So I feel that's a big policy issue that could maybe be addressed in Europe. So how can stateless people, and it is something that would benefit many refugees as well, how can they gain some kind of formal recognition for the knowledge and the skills that they've already acquired?
Thomas McGee, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed for coming on and sharing your thoughts and also your contribution through your article and the work that you continue to do. Thanks so much indeed. All right, that's Thomas McGee talking to us and working out of Melbourne Law School, focusing on a number of issues, but statelessness, one of the ones that he's very concerned about. All right, so again, it's about awareness and getting a sense of what people who are stateless actually go through and what their typical lives are. Sometimes they look very normal, but underneath there's so much more going on. Let's find out a little bit more from this example of a young woman living in the United States who is stateless, and this is her story.
Hi, my name is Ekaterina, or as my mom calls me, Katya. I'm an artist, a volunteer, a daughter, a sister, and an auntie to an 8-year-old girl I've never met. I live in San Francisco. I'm also stateless. I have no nationality, no passport, and here in the US, no legal pathway to citizenship. It's early morning. Oh my gosh, I adore my housemate. Look at this, she made me a cup of coffee. Well, our day is about to begin, and my friend's here. She's picking me up, and we are going swimming.
You ready to swim? I am ready to swim. How about you?
So ready.
Let's go.
Swimming makes me feel truly free. Swimming in open water doesn't cost anything. As a stateless person, it's hard to feel like I belong anywhere. Swimming gives me a sense of belonging and freedom. I've been separated from my family for almost 30 years. But my mom and I keep in touch thanks to technology. We talk almost every day.
I'm so happy to see you.
I was born in the Soviet Union. I traveled to the United States at 16 on a Soviet passport, yet my country disappeared, and with it, my nationality. I love to paint. I try to paint daily. I dream of traveling the world someday and painting landscapes from all across the globe. Living without nationality is not easy. Can't legally work or get a driver's license. To get around, I usually walk or ride my bike. To protect myself, I don't show my face on camera. I try to remain hopeful and positive. If I were to become a citizen, the first thing I'd do is make plans to travel back to see my family.
Oh, hi, darling. Hi.
I hope my story inspires you to learn more about statelessness.
Let's see if we can get like to the other end and then out.
Let's stop this madness.
There you go. Very powerful testimony there from that young woman living in the United States and trying to do the best she can under the circumstances she finds herself in. And I think tells volumes about many of the people around us. Sometimes we don't even notice, who, as they describe themselves, often feel invisible because of this statelessness that they find themselves in. All right, let's continue to explore some of these themes, and we're now joined by Chris Nash, who's the director and co-founder of the European Network on Statelessness. He's worked in the refugee, migration and human rights field for over 20 years now, initially as an asylum lawyer and then at several national and international NGOs, including Amnesty International. The European Network on Statelessness, ENS, is a civil society alliance of over 150 organisations and individual experts in 41 countries committed to addressing statelessness in Europe. And the article contribution looks at what needs to be done in Europe to ensure that everyone can realise their right to a nationality. So, Chris Nash, thanks so much indeed for joining us. It's almost difficult to believe that in a developed part of the world like Europe, there would be people who are stateless. Let's hear from you.
Sure, and yes, I mean, Europe often likes to see itself as a model of democracy and human rights, but it's actually home to a surprising number of stateless people, like you said, at least 500,000 in total, many born in Europe itself, but also more recent arrivals. And by any yardstick, the countries of Europe must do more to solve this very solvable issue. And the reason I say that is because an international legal framework guaranteeing protection to stateless people and setting clear rules for preventing statelessness has been in place for at least a generation. So if all state signatories had translated this into effective national law, the problem would have been eradicated by now. But I guess identity politics, migration debates, and questions about who does and doesn't belong have got in the way of this. So while some progress has been made in recent years, and it's important to acknowledge that, much more needs to be done, and quickly. Firstly, half of all European states do not have full safeguards in their nationality laws to grant children born on their territory nationality if they would otherwise be stateless. And this gap is leaving thousands of children to continue to grow up stateless. Secondly, shockingly in my view, only 12 European states have established dedicated procedures to identify who on their territory is stateless and owed protection under international law. And this leaves many stateless people in legal limbo with no way to regularise their stay, but equally nowhere to go, and often at risk of detention and destitution. And thirdly, to pick up on the previous interview, we know that many thousands of those forcibly displaced to Europe every year are stateless, but asylum law and policy too often fails to adequately address their particular protection needs. Countries across Europe could fix this if they showed sufficient political will and put in place laws and policies that implement their obligations under international law. At ENS, we've actually established a statelessness index with comparative information on 24 countries showing exactly what needs to change. And as a civil society alliance with over 150 members in 41 countries, we stand alongside stateless people in demanding reform, and we also stand ready to work with governments and other actors to help achieve this.
So, Chris, I mean, is it just political will? I mean, you know, when I look at Europe and the European Union, for example, there's a whole bunch of rules that everyone needs to abide by. How do stateless people slip through the net?
It's a good question. And I mean, although state-led initiatives are, clearly important, to date, these have proved inadequate and sporadic. And therefore urgent attention by regional bodies such as the EU and the Council of Europe is now required to catalyse reform and end statelessness. So despite the fact that there were landmark European Council conclusions in 2015 and rallying cries from the European Parliament, Europe as a region still lacks a common approach to statelessness akin to regional strategies adopted in the Americas and West Africa. The next phase of UNHCR's I Belong campaign will continue to galvanise action, but ending statelessness in Europe would take longer than 4 years, and it will require new coalitions with people affected and an ever closer monitoring of law, policy and practice to hold governments to account. Put simply, this is an issue Europe cannot continue to ignore if it is up to uphold its long-standing values of freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law and human rights. Hopefully, today's launch of the Statelessness in Atlas will add impetus towards achieving that.
Yeah. In your article, you state that stateless people themselves are often not involved in the debate, and that state-led initiatives, though welcome, are not enough. And I just wonder, how could stateless people be more involved in the debate, and what initiatives beyond government initiatives are needed to overcome statelessness in Europe?
Yes, so I mean, I think that's a really important point, and it's vital to emphasize that stateless people don't fall into a single category, but rather we need to recognize their diverse individual and myriad identities. They are of different genders, ages, sexual orientations, socioeconomic backgrounds, abilities, languages, religions, and ethnicities. Stateless people have their own agency and voice, and they must be heard as part of the decision-making processes that affect their lives, whether that's at a local, national, or global level. Ultimately, statelessness can only be effectively addressed, I think, if the multiple identities and experiences of those directly affected by it are taken into account, and also that the links between statelessness and racism, patriarchy, and other forms of oppression are properly understood.
All right, so the Atlas of the Stateless is the beginning, I guess, of a lot of work that's required on statelessness. What else do you think we should be focusing on in the future work, particularly around statelessness in Europe?
Yeah, well, firstly, just to say how welcome it is to have a high-profile global change maker such as the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation take up the issue of statelessness and help to shine a spotlight on it, given that historically it was so ignored. Increasing awareness and understanding about the problem is, of course, an essential precursor to solving it. And I guess one thing that Rosa Luxemburg can do is to help ensure that stateless people themselves continue to have a platform and are directly heard in the debate. For example, by asking them to contribute articles to key publications such as the Atlas, to speak at events like the one here today, and more broadly to help shape our collective calls for reform. But I guess secondly, as a grant-making body, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation has the opportunity to directly support civil society efforts to address statelessness in Europe and globally, which is particularly important, I think, given that currently relatively few donors are sensitized to the issue or fully recognize its nexus with issues such as forced migration, child rights, and anti-discrimination. At ENS, we're actually very grateful for funding we are currently receiving from Rosa Luxemburg to support research we're doing looking at the nexus between statelessness and access to health rights, particularly in the context of the current pandemic. But it's also important to highlight a funding gap that currently exists for many grassroots and community-led organizations working on the ground, who often find themselves ineligible or unable to access even the limited funding streams that are currently available. So anything that Rosa Luxemburg can help to fill this gap would be hugely valuable, as ultimately we can't end statelessness without the people directly affected by it.
All right, Chris Nash, very important points. Thanks very much indeed for coming through. Thanks for your article and the work that you continue to do at the European Network on Statelessness. Thanks so much indeed.
Thank you.
All right, that's Chris Nash, co-founder of ENS, sharing his thoughts about the situation in Europe. And as he said, one would have thought that in Europe they're perhaps better able to manage some of these issues, but political will is one of the challenges that they face there. All right, before we meet our next speaker, let's hear from other authors that have contributed to the Atlas.
Since the passage of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, a robust guarantee of jus soli citizenship for all has been a cornerstone of American national identity. Recent calls by President Trump and his allies to exclude from this guarantee the children of unauthorized migrants born in the United States would be a disaster for many, and for stateless people in particular. Many stateless people stranded in the United States are unauthorized migrants. And the only guarantee that their children won't inherit their statelessness is jus soli citizenship. Without this constitutional protection, these children would be condemned to statelessness and unable to escape their inheritance of unauthorized migration. Please read my contribution to the Atlas to learn more.
Tens of thousands of migrants, mostly Bengalis, are at the risk of losing their Indian citizenship in the country's northeastern state of Assam, all because of an exercise involving the updating of the National Register of Citizens, NRC for short. The NRC, which was first done up in Assam in 1951, is now being updated in the state as per orders of the Indian Supreme Court. But the country's ruling BJP has asked for extending this exercise to other parts of the country, apparently to weed out illegal migrants from neighboring Bangladesh. Though this exercise was initially seen by many as targeting Indian Muslims, it now seems that the Bengalis, Hindus and Muslims alike, who have been the worst victims of the country's partition 73 years ago, are looking at a new phase of statelessness.
You're still watching a special broadcast on the launch of the publication, the Atlas of the Stateless. And it's great to have many of you who've joined us from around the world online, hearing from some of the authors and contributors to the Atlas, sharing their thoughts on this very important subject and reminding us that there's millions of people who sometimes sadly are invisible, but we need to help create awareness so that they are seen and that things can be done to help them in their plight. All right, let's speak to another article contributor, Stephanie de Goya, who's an ACLS Burkhardt Fellow at UCLA and an Associate Professor at William Nett University. She's co-author of The Right to Have Rights and is completing a book on the history of naturalization in the common law tradition entitled Acts of Naturalization. She's written widely on immigration and rights in venues such as The Guardian, The Nation, as well as Dissent. Her article, Rethinking Birthright, examines American history and asks if it might be time to rethink the use of birth and biological connection as requirements for irrevocable citizenship. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us and welcome.
Oh.
All right, share your thoughts with us. What did you write about?
My article, it doesn't look at statelessness directly, but what I sort of philosophically and politically and historically examine is some weaknesses in American nationality law that can produce statelessness. And a lot of this has to do with the way that naturalized citizens are disenfranchised and made inferior to natural citizens, those who are born on U.S. territory or are a descendant of somebody with a biological attachment to the United States. Naturalized citizens, we know, are asked to demonstrate skills and knowledge that natural citizens do not or need not ever possess. So, for example, naturalized citizens have to demonstrate that they read, write, and speak English. And these sorts of tests do call to mind the historical use of literacy tests as a means to disenfranchise racial minorities in the United States. Naturalized citizens also need to possess a solid understanding of U.S. history and government. And additionally, they need to demonstrate good moral character and attachment to the U.S. Constitution. But most importantly, for the sake of what we're talking about in the Atlas today, is that naturalized citizens can be denaturalized. They can lose their nationality for reasons of fraud and treason. Now, again, these are very rare instances, but it is possible. And under the current U.S. administration, we've seen an uptick in interest in denaturalization as a means of excluding people from citizenship and ultimately nationality. So while birthright protections, as we just saw in one of the videos, offer incredible resources for people in the U.S., they can be a source of inequality for others, and that's what was the focus of my article.
All right, and you talk about denaturalization, and in the article you say that it's worse than a crime, that the death penalty because it banned people from American law. Mm-hmm. Take us through that a bit more.
Right, statelessness is has often been seen as a European or a global problem that isn't as relevant to the United States. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt in the 1960s was actually the first to sort of identify the U.S. capacity for denaturalization as a crime against humanity. And that's because it banishes people from U.S. law. And for this very reason, in the 1960s, Hannah Arendt suggested it should be constitutionally impossible to deprive a naturalized citizen of their citizenship. And today, more than ever, I think we need to think of the dangers of denaturalization. The problem is far from marginal. In February 2020, the U.S. Justice Department created an official section in its immigration office to strip citizenship rights from naturalized immigrants. And over the past 3 years, it's been reported that denaturalization case referrals to the department have increased 600%. And Stephen Miller, who's driven much of President Trump's immigration policy, has also said that denaturalization should be part of a broad pushback on immigration. We should also remember, however, that denaturalization isn't linked or limited to President Trump's administration. It actually began as a possibility or something that the government was looking into with increased regularness with the Obama administration. So if anything, I would say that the Trump administration has made denaturalization much more visible as something that is possible in U.S. law, and he has exposed, or the administration has exposed, how much fear it can provoke in a populace and ultimately prevent people from naturalizing for fears of being tripped up in some kind of broadly defined definition of fraud. So I think in terms of denaturalization in the U.S., we're really seeing increased exposure to its dangers.
All right, and I would imagine in other parts of the world it can be used as a political weapon, sadly, and that then becomes another layer of persecution.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so what else do you think we should be focusing on? You know, again, this atlas is a great publication, but perhaps is a beginning of a bigger journey. What else do you think one needs to look at, particularly when you consider this issue from the United States?
Right. I really am grateful that the Atlas of the stateless is looking at statelessness in the American context. As I mentioned, statelessness is often not thought to be an American problem, although we do know from a recent study by the Center for Migration Studies in New York that there's an estimated 200,000 people who are stateless or at risk of becoming stateless in the US, so it is quite significantly a problem. We do have a new president who will be incoming in January, and I think this is a very opportune time to keep up the advocacy and exposure to issues of statelessness in the US, and that's something that the Atlas is surely doing. Historically, the US has been a key donor to the UNHCR, however, hasn't ratified the 54 and 61 conventions on statelessness. So I think as we change administrations, keeping up the pressure and the exposure to the problem will be a key priority. Beyond that, a longer-term goal is, of course, to get the U.S. to adopt a legal framework that allows a pathway to citizenship for stateless individuals on the basis of statelessness alone, so it doesn't have to be packaged in a refugee asylum case, for instance. Again, we'll have to, this is a problem of political will, but it is ultimately the goal here, which is to end statelessness. And of course, we need better data. We need to know what populations are at risk of statelessness and how to identify them.
All right, Stephanie, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks so much indeed for your contribution, your article, and also joining us on the program today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, that's Stephanie Deguia speaking to us from the United States, a country that is also dealing with statelessness. And again, developed nations such as the US, one of these issues that often we don't think about or associate with them, but there you have it. All right, we're going to meet another contributor in just a few moments.
This is my passport, and this is Hannah Arendt. This is what I'm going to talk about. It was the summary of Hannah Arendt's personal experience of years of statelessness when she formulated in 1949 the right to have rights. She described stateless people as worldless, as excluded from social and political community. Without the right to have rights, all other human rights are void. This is also true for all those who have been disenfranchised, people without papers, refugees without resident status, the homeless, unemployed and exploited. People are not born as equals, but are made equals by members of a group. Some governments and political parties also nowadays instrumentalize human rights. Human rights are not in themselves just or inclusive. A just society requires a redefinition of human rights as rights of resistance against all forms of injustice and oppression.
The human right to a nationality is contained in many international human rights instruments, starting with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Unfortunately, all of these instruments do not specify to which nationality an individual is precisely entitled. And this is why we need the two statelessness conventions. The first, on the status of stateless persons, defines who is considered a stateless person, which is very important to have a binding universal definition. And the second statelessness convention on the reduction of statelessness then specifies under which conditions a state has to give its nationality to an individual. So together they are of paramount importance for the protection of stateless persons and for the prevention of statelessness. And this is why advocating for accession to these conventions is a high priority for UNHCR.
You're watching a special broadcast on the launch of the publication, the Atlas of the Stateless, an important publication that really starts to tell the story and spread the word about millions of people across the world who find themselves stateless, with the myriad of challenges and consequences that has. And often, as they describe themselves, are invisible in the places that they find themselves and face an uphill battle almost every single day. We've been hearing from a number of contributors that have placed articles in this atlas, and we meet one of them now, Bronwyn Manby, who's an expert on nationality law in Africa and has worked closely with the UNHCR within the campaign to end statelessness. And her piece is in the heightened risk of statelessness for people of a nomadic lifestyle, with a focus on West Africa. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. Take us through some of the highlights of your article.
Good day, and thank you for asking me to speak here. So my piece focuses specifically on the situation of nomads. And the idea of nationality as a legal status has, of course, a direct connection to the legal idea of a state. And one of the challenges of nomadic peoples is that nationality is connected, in essence, to territorial sovereignty. So what do you do with people who are not of a fixed address, who move perhaps between states and are not either actually or in perception seen to be connected to a particular state? And across the world, people who follow nomadic lifestyles or who have historically followed nomadic lifestyles face particular challenges in having their nationality of a state recognized. And my article looks at the context of West Africa in particular, where you have several million people who are nomadic pastoralists, and there are millions of people more generally across Africa. And they, while certainly not all of them are stateless by any means, in general, they face particular challenges in proving nationality. And these can be based on different contexts. So on the one hand, historically, people in nomadic groups may have felt very little connection to the modern states whose borders were created by European colonization. They didn't feel any need to obtain identity documents, to indicate their loyalty to a geographical construction which they didn't much see the relevance of. And then secondly, when these states were transferred and became independent, many of them didn't have documents. They had no documents connecting them to the previous European power, and then very remote areas, birth registration was and remains often very low. So the proof of which country they might be connected to is difficult. And then finally, many of them face discrimination. A lot of people of nomadic heritage are born and live in a fixed place now. They might be teachers or doctors or workmen of different types, and they are not in fact following a nomadic lifestyle. But because of what their last name reveals, and because of discrimination around that, they face exclusion from contemporary society. And the laws of the states where they live are still to today largely based on European models, which assume that everybody's birth is registered, everybody's marriage is registered, everybody can show connections in a world in which documentation is perfect to a particular state. And if you don't have those documents, and in addition, it's perceived that you belong to a group whose nationality is doubtful, very often you can face struggles in showing nationality today. And while a strategy of state avoidance was possible in the early 20th century, it's more and more difficult now.
Now, you say that in one of your many studies that the populations most at risk of statelessness in West Africa fall into three main groups: migrants, historical or contemporary, and their descendants, orphans, and other vulnerable children, including those trafficked for various purposes, and broader populations, including nomadic and pastoralist ethnic groups who regularly cross borders. Why can existing laws and processes not be applied to nomads, even though nomadic communities have always existed in these regions? All right, it looks like we might have lost Bronwyn.
Hello, you've come back in. Sorry.
Oh, there we go. Great. Did you get my question, Bronwyn?
I did not. Please repeat it.
All right. Okay. So essentially, I'm asking why can't existing laws and processes not be applied to nomads, even though these nomadic communities have always existed in the region?
I think it really relates to the questions around state succession. The European powers drew the lines around the existing territories in West Africa. They are not natural nations of single ethnic groups or even perceived single ethnic groups. And so the question of who belongs and who does not belong within a particular state is often unclear. And it can be unclear in different ways. It can be unclear because of lack of documentation, but also unclear in the sense that nomadic groups have moved between different states, and which particular state is it they're connected to can be hard to establish. And the laws and procedures were designed in a context in which working out who should belong to a particular state was not the priority for the law. Those administering those laws are more concerned to say, no, we don't want to make sure anybody who's not entitled gets in accidentally or by fraud, rather than saying, how can we ensure that the people who are entitled are documented and registered as members of the national community?
One issue that often, I observe as a journalist is the way our borders were drawn by the colonial era. And so you find people on two sides of a border who perhaps share one ethnicity, but one may be a francophone country and another anglophone country, but they're both Hausa and they move backwards and forwards between these two countries. This, I guess, contributes in many ways to some of the challenges of some people being caught on the wrong side of the border.
No, absolutely. According to whether your colonial power happened to be British or French or Belgian, the laws you get still follow those models, and they must be, the variations between them must be completely bemusing for somebody on the ground who says, no, but I'm Hausa. What are you talking about? I don't, And so there's a need to adapt, especially the procedures, but also the substantive provisions to take account of those borders. And some states have tried to do so, but there's a need really to harmonize those efforts across states. And many of these questions about cross-border populations, whether they be settled agricultural populations or nomadic populations, will require collaboration between states to say, this person has got a connection to both sides of the border. Which of us is going to give them documents, or maybe both? Because dual nationality is increasingly recognized, and yet a person who might have entitlement to two nationalities is nonetheless a higher risk of statelessness, even though in principle they might be able to get two sets of documents if the two states could sort themselves out to actually recognize that.
All right, and one question I'm asking all our contributors today is, what more can we do, particularly from a West African context? This atlas is seen as a groundwork, a beginning work, but what else should we focus on, particularly when we think about the nomadic communities of West Africa?
I think, although it is very common for people to say, well, that the written law is not that important, what really matters is how people feel, how they belong. What one increasingly sees is that actually the written law really does matter. And I think for looking at nationality law reform, focusing on the right to a nationality and creating rights based on birth in the territory over one or two generations, and looking at establishing procedures that establish that a person has the right to a nationality in a place where they have the strongest connections, rather than looking at how can we identify people as stateless persons and protect them as stateless persons, which may be very important in other contexts. The key focus, I think, in West Africa and indeed Africa generally is to say, let's look at the right to a nationality in the place where the person has the strongest connections. And in order to do that, I think a particularly important focus is looking at current procedures to try and strengthen identification systems in Africa. There's a very strong proof to improve birth very strong push to improve birth registration, which is really important. But there's also a strong push to create new biometric national identity systems, with the idea that technological improvements will sort out these questions of who is who. But actually, you can't sort out those questions unless you also look at the underlying laws and principles about who is recognized where, and harmonizing those laws so that people do not fall in the gaps.
Bronwyn Mamby, thanks so much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us on this very important subject. And we look forward to more articles on the work that you're doing. Thank you so much. All right, that's Bronwyn Mamby, who's an expert on nationality law in Africa, giving us a sense of what's happening, particularly on the west part of our continent, and nomadic communities in particular, who've been doing what they do for centuries, getting caught up in this issue of statelessness. Stay with us, we're still going to meet another contributor.
Given the erosion of the two-state solution, many law scholars argue that Palestine as entity doesn't currently fully satisfy the criteria of statehood according to Montevideo Agreement. Therefore, Palestinians who had not acquired the nationality of a third country continue to be considered as stateless people by the purpose of international law. The UNGA resolution to upgrade the Palestinian Authority status to at the UN to a non-member state in 2012 really doesn't change this reality. To conclude, Palestinians refugees could be considered as a special category of stateless people, but not benefiting from the 1954 and 1961 conventions related to stateless persons.
In the Baltic states, particularly in Latvia and Estonia, the question of stateless is strictly connected to Russian-speaking minority. Following the restoration of independence in 1991, Latvia and Estonia introduced restrictive policies that granted citizenship only to those who had had it before the start of the Soviet occupation in 1940, and to their descendants. As a result, about 1/3 of population of these countries were deprived of citizenship. In Latvia, they were declared to be non-citizens, and in Estonia, they received the status of undetermined citizenship. In spite of quite a dynamic process of naturalization, there are still 6% of people with undetermined citizenship in Estonia, and more or less 11% of non-citizens in Latvia.
In Thailand, stateless people are mostly ethnic minorities who are born in the country but lack a birth registration document due to geographical, economic, or educational barriers. There are approximately 500,000 stateless people in Thailand. Without any nationality, stateless children may have difficulty in accessing a wide range of basic human rights, including healthcare. My PhD thesis, entitled Investigation into Health Disparities Among Stateless Children in Tak Province, Thailand, revealed that stateless children were less likely to utilize outpatient services compared to their Thai counterparts. In addition, stateless children are more likely to experience infectious diseases than Thai children. Overall, the health of stateless children seems to be worse off than their Thai counterparts.
Hello, you're watching a special broadcast on the launch of a very special and important publication, the Atlas of the Stateless, looking at the plight of people that have been denied a nationality for one reason or the other. Millions of people are affected around the world, and they can't do simple things like sometimes even just opening a bank account, going to school, getting a job. Even seeing a doctor can become impossible if you have no nationality, no identity, and no state, being stateless. So today, with this publication and this broadcast, we're starting this journey of spreading awareness, because I think a lot of us are not aware of the people that perhaps are close in our communities who are going through this, and hopefully with awareness and spreading the word, their plight can be made less with some interventions. We've been asking a number of contributors to join us on this broadcast to share their thoughts, particularly around some of the words that they've put in this atlas. And one of them is Melanie Karna, who's the Senior Legal Coordinator and Head of the Statelessness section at the UNHCR headquarters in Geneva. She leads the team responsible for supporting UNHCR's statelessness mandate and meeting the ambitious objectives of the #IBelong campaign to end statelessness by 2024. She's also the co-editor with Laura van Vas of the 2017 volume of Solving Statelessness. And she talks to us a little bit about the UNHC #IBelong campaign and its milestones and achievements. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to this special broadcast. Talk to us a little bit about #IBelong campaign and UNHCR's work around statelessness.
Sure. Well, thanks, first of all, for organizing this event and calling attention to the I Belong campaign, which is, of course, celebrating an anniversary this month. We're 6 years in. And in terms of UNHCR's work, a lot of it relates very much to what you just referenced, namely raising awareness. The I Belong campaign was launched precisely with that intent, Peter, to really raise the public's awareness of the statelessness issue. It's still not a household word. Most people have never heard of statelessness and therefore have no understanding of the stigma and rights deprivations typically associated with it, or the fact that it affects millions of people around the world in the 21st century. So a big part of UNHCR's work is exactly that. It's to raise awareness. It's to kind of fill a knowledge gap and let people be empowered to learn more, so that they feel that they can take some action and contribute in a positive way, including by raising the issue with their own governments. And that's another part of UNHCR's work. Complementary part is to advocate directly with governments in favor of the international standards that prevent and reduce statelessness, standards that many others have referred to today. They're embodied, of course, in the 2 UN statelessness conventions and complementary provisions of international law. They're not terribly complex, but they do require a little bit of expertise and know-how. So another thing that UNHCR does is provide some direct technical assistance to governments to enable them to implement those standards where the will is there to do so. So we work directly with parliamentarians and other parts of governments to translate those standards into national law and practice. And a final thing I would mention is that we provide legal assistance directly to stateless people. It's a kind of accompaniment to help them pursue a nationality solution and obtain one where that is possible. Of course, all of these things that we do, everything I just mentioned, we do very much with partners. We don't do any of these things alone. We have a very nice community of NGOs, academics, faith-based groups, international organizations, foundations like Rosa-Luxemburg, and many others who are working together. And we're all basically working in favor of inclusive societies in the 21st century where everyone can say they belong.
Hashtag I Belong. This event, as you've mentioned, is taking place almost exactly on the 6th anniversary of the 10-year-long Hashtag I Belong campaign to end statelessness, a campaign launched and led largely by the UNHCR. The question is this campaign succeeding, and do you think statelessness will be over by 2024?
Well, thank you for that question. I think, again, the purpose of the campaign was to raise awareness and galvanize will and action. And I think we have succeeded to a certain extent, again, with partners in doing that. There's a tremendous amount of activity compared with 6 years ago. We have new regional level declarations. We have new national action plans. We have a number of achievements that I detail in my piece in the Atlas. In terms of your question of whether statelessness will be eradicated in 2024, I think the good news is that there are likely to be some states and potentially even some regions where statelessness is eradicated by 2024. Kyrgyzstan, of course, last year became the first state to announce an end to all known cases of statelessness on its territory, and some of its neighbors, including Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, have recently taken very important strides in the same direction, such that I think we will see some more states in Central Asia, and maybe even the region as a whole, positioned to declare an end to statelessness by 2024. There are some other states with very substantial populations like Thailand, which records more than 400,000 stateless people, that have made political commitments in connection with the campaign to end statelessness by 2024. Let's see if they get there. And on the African continent, from Cote d'Ivoire to Rwanda, I guess moving west to east, we've seen so many states start to put in place national action plans to eradicate statelessness by 2024. And on the prevention side, there have been some 25 new accessions to the Statelessness Convention since the campaign was launched, and that's just critical because there we're basically getting more governments into the tent, if you like, on the international standards that, as Chris said, would wipe out this problem in a generation if they were universally implemented. So on the prevention side, we're seeing good progress too. In addition to the accessions, we've had some 10 very positive law reforms since the campaign was launched. So states that have either removed discrimination of one kind or another from their nationality laws or adopted safeguards to the nationality law that help prevent statelessness from occurring in the first place. And in addition to all of that, I would say, back to the partnership point, in the time that we've been engaged in this campaign, this endeavor, we've seen that many more mainstream rights advocacy groups, so women's rights groups, minorities' rights groups, children's rights actors, have embraced this as their cause too. And to me, that's one of the greatest areas of hope as we look ahead, that this really is getting much more mainstream attention. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. And so I do think, yes, there's been very good progress. But of course, as anybody who follows this issue even remotely closely will know, in order to actually end statelessness by 2024, we would need some major breakthroughs of political will in places like Myanmar and the Middle East, among others.
All right, somebody who's watching this has posed a question and said that, do you have data on the situation in Ethiopia and Mozambique with regards to statelessness amongst displaced persons?
I don't know if that's a question for me specifically.
Yeah. All right. So what do we know about the plight of people in Ethiopia, Mozambique? Because it is, I suppose, it's an issue across the continent, really.
Yes, I mean, of course, I would separate those two, but in Ethiopia and Eritrea, there have been issues associated with the coming into being of Eritrea. Bronwyn earlier referred to, the drawing of national boundaries and state succession. Those are always big issues when it comes to statelessness. And of course, there's a lot of tension between those two countries. And if one country considers you as belonging to it, the other one may say, well, you're certainly not ours, and people may have a different perception. So it's very much an issue of concern, as between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Also, of course, the nexus to displacement in the region generally, that Thomas talked about a bit, vis-a-vis displaced Syrians. That's, of course, very much an issue in the Horn of Africa as well. Lots of long-standing displacement, lots of, drawing of borders rather artificially, plus some relatively recent shifts. So a lot of complicated factors at play.
All right, perhaps as a final question, because this is a central theme of what you're trying to do and what this atlas is about, is can awareness really make a difference?
I think so. I think we've seen that very tangibly. I do not think we would have 25 new parties to the statelessness conventions and 10 good law reforms, including the elimination of gender discrimination in 2 countries, Madagascar and Sierra Leone, allowing mothers to transmit nationality to their children on an equal basis as fathers. I think that's very much attributable to the awareness raising that UNHCR and a broad coalition of actors have done. So yes, I would very much encourage Rosa-Luxemburg to stay on this path. I think the foundation has done a terrific job in pulling together this atlas. And as Chris was saying earlier, I think this is exactly the kind of thing that the foundation should continue to do, in this brave new virtual world that we all live in. Conversations among very disparate actors who may not have had opportunities to speak to each other directly before are perhaps, paradoxically more possible than ever. And so bringing together, groups, especially in countries where this is a particular problem, and empowering stateless people themselves to become agents in their own solution strategy. I think that's something that the foundation can continue to do. And I would also encourage the foundation to consider financial support to the organizations that are engaged in the cause, as Chris said, and particularly those that are helping to provide the individual legal assistance to stateless people. That is an area that needs to be scaled up if we're going to accelerate solutions by 2024.
The race is on, the clock is ticking, and as you said, it's going to require massive effort by all of us, and in particular those with the political power to effect change. But thanks so much indeed for contributing and sharing your thoughts with us on this very important subject as we launch this important publication. Thanks so much indeed, Melanie Kana. All right, so that was Melanie Kana, who's with the UNHCR celebrating 6 years of the #IBelong campaign. All right, let's hear from the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung Program Director, Social Rights here in South Africa. Perhaps as a final word to say thank you for you joining us in this very important day. Let's welcome Jan Leidecker. Jan?
Hello, and a wonderful good afternoon from rainy Johannesburg. And I think it's one of the greatest things about this event is that we can have a global community working on statelessness, and we're broadcasting it here today with you, who did an amazing job in moderating and facilitating the discussion today and broadcasting this live. So yeah, throughout the internet world directly from here. And I mean, Melanie has quite gently put the ball on my court with regards to funding, and maybe let's just say from a perspective of the Southern African office that yes, we actually really started working with UNHCR and NGOs here in the region on this topic years ago, because it's for us one of the most beneficial things we can do. We work on social justice and democratic participation. And statelessness is an indicator of in any society where it appears, of social injustice and a lack of participation. So if we find solution for stateless people in the countries we work in with NGOs and strengthening their capacity to act themselves and helping to overcome the issue of statelessness, every single time we always also found solution for broader and different problems of democratic participation, of failure to act, for example, by organizations like the Ministry of Home Affairs here in South Africa. And we really think that statelessness is for us an amplifier for democratic participation, social justice. So we will look into these funding options. But first and all for us, I think we are an organization supporting advocacy and political education. And this atlas that has been printed more than 100,000 times and will also be available in English for distribution is for us our next tool to start these conversations where we live and to build awareness and support campaigns, and even support, maybe looking into the support of legal support for stateless people themselves.
All right, Jan, thanks so much indeed, and thanks so much to RLS for the work that you continue to do and contributions that you're making to this critically important subject. And we can't waste any more time, any more minutes, because millions of lives depend on us spreading the word, spreading the gospel, making it a top-of-mind issue, and putting pressure on those that have the power to effect change to help these people, many of whom are living invisibly in our communities. And so if there's one thing we can do as a result of this broadcast and this launch of this publication, is to go and spread the gospel. Speak to people who matter, who can do something. Let's all collectively make a push and make sure that statelessness is not a word that we use in the future, that we find a way to put an end to it. To all of you who've tuned in, thank you so much indeed for watching and participating in this broadcast. To our speakers who've contributed to the Atlas, thank you so much indeed for the work that you do in your various areas of contribution. And thank you for writing in this Atlas. And for those that you might have seen on video, also authors, we thank them. So to all of you, thanks so much. Take care. And we hope to see you again soon. In the meantime, fight the good fight. Bye-bye.